Hi, this is Molly Enholm. Today we're going to be looking at John Singleton Copley, who is unarguably among the most important of the colonial era pre-revolutionary artists in the United States. In this portion of the talk, we're going to be looking at his early portraits, which are considered by many to be his most important, and we will contrast those later in the second half with the portraits and paintings of his English period. In terms of his style, this quote from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. sums it up nicely. It reads, John Singleton Copley's American portraits are characterized by fine, detailed representations of faces and fabrics, and we'll be looking at that. There's some fabulous examples. And then, in part two, we'll switch over and look at his later career, his English style, where he moves toward bold brushstrokes and dramatic compositions common to Romanticism. But we'll save that for later. John Singleton Copley, as well as the equally famous, if not a little bit more famous, Benjamin West, were both born in the colonial period. Copley was born up in Boston in 1738, and Benjamin West, also in 1738, was born just west, ironically, of Philadelphia. Both of these artists were relatively self-trained. There were no real art academies in the United States during the colonial period. It's also worthy to note that both of these artists would become expatriates. They would both leave what would become the United States and spend much of their career in England. Benjamin West leaves first in 1760. He goes straight to Rome, and then he kind of does the grand tour in reverse, starting in Italy, going up through Paris, and then back to England, where he was supposed to come back to the United States, but he doesn't. More on that in a different talk. Copley, on the other hand, waits until 1774 before he goes, and he goes straight to England, where he meets up with Benjamin West, Sir Joshua Reynolds, with whom he had been corresponding with from time to time over the years. So let's go back to Copley and see how that all happens. Being self-taught doesn't mean, however, that there was nobody showing him the tricks of the trade, how to draw, how to mix pigments, how to set up his palette, all of those kind of things. His stepfather, Peter Pelham, whom his mother married in 1748, was actually a painter, but he's better known today really as an engraver. And really it was in that workshop that John Singleton Copley began to learn to be an artist. His stepfather, Peter Pelham, had the contract to do all of the engravings for a painter named John Smibert, who had trained in London. And so it was really in this atmosphere, making engravings, the drawings, pulling the prints, coloring some of those engravings, and painting himself. His stepfather did do portrait painting. That is what formed Copley's basic education. It may not have been the French Royal Academy, but it wasn't like he was drawing with a stick in the dirt. He did have some formal training in that studio. And what we're seeing here is a result of that training. This is simply amazing. By now, John Singleton Copley is about 26, 27 years old. He is firmly established as just about the best portrait painter in Boston. And we can really see why with this painting. I mean, just pause the video and just look at this for a minute. Find a nice high-res version of it on the internet and look at the attention to detail. The fabrics, the velvet, the silk, the satin, the wood, the reflection, the fur of the squirrel, the metallic gold of that chain, the water glass, always a display of skill to do glass with liquid in it. I mean, everything is just showing what a virtuoso painter this guy is. And he did that for a reason, because this was not just another portrait. This was something that he made to show off his skills, because he made this not for a patron. This is his younger half-brother, Henry Pelham, but he made this to send over to England, because he was getting a little bit itchy with staying in Boston at the time. He wanted some advice, some feedback from Benjamin West, Sir Joshua Reynolds, the best of the English painters, to see if he should make that jump himself. Should he leave Boston and go to England, where he would be surrounded by the elite painters that he knew of, or should he remain in Boston? That was the question that was plaguing young Copley at this time. As you might imagine, looking at this detail, the feedback was pretty positive. Sir Joshua Reynolds gave it a big thumbs up. Wonderful performance, he says. You can be one of the best painters in the world. But, Sir Joshua Reynolds would say, you need to come here. You need to come to England. You need to remove yourself from Boston, where you're going to get stuck in working in what he called his little way in Boston. He could become one of the best painters in the world, but Sir Joshua Reynolds felt for Copley to achieve this, he absolutely had to come and continue his artistic education in England and the continent. The question was Copley ready to go? And the answer was no, not yet. And that's actually a pretty good thing, because what he does instead is give us a variety of portraits from different Bostonians of the time, the revolutionaries, the loyalists, the redcoats, and he really captures with such exquisite detail these different individuals in Boston society. So let's take a closer look at Paul Revere before he became Paul Revere, so to speak. The art critic Robert Hughes, in his book American Visions, describes this portrait as so. He says, Copley's portrait of Revere is a manifesto of democratic American pride in work, the radical as craftsman. There is no finery here. He sits in his shirt sleeves, holding his chin in thought, fixing the viewer with his blank stare. He is holding one of his own products, a silver teapot. He was a metal engraver. It is poised above the work rest, which is that brown cushion, on the mahogany table. And again, look at all those details, just like the boy with the squirrel that he is able to achieve with pigment on canvas in this work. 3 engraving tools lie on the table, Hughes describes. Copley's design edits out workbench clutter to emphasize 2 virtuoso passages of painting. The reflections of Revere's fingers. I mean, look closely at that teapot and you see that reflection. It's so fantastic. To the reflection of the window. And that reflection bends around the teapot. So amazing. And that's such a classical device. You see that used in Baroque still life paintings. You see it in the Flemish primitives. You see it in I can't think of the word, Mannerist paintings. And then when Hughes goes on to talk about this painting, he talks about the structures and folds in that white shirt and how vividly it reads against that dark background, which he compares to the great Baroque painter Francisco de Zurbarán from Spain, and that use of tenebrism, that use of extreme lights and darks, which really draws us back again and again to the face, to that intense stare of the craftsman, of Paul Revere looking back at us, intently looking with the same intensity as Jack Black? Well, who knows? I don't know if there's a relation. But anyways, back to Paul Revere. It really brings us back to that iconic figure from American history, even before he was mythologized by Longfellow, back to that time and place. And he does this with several important key figures from this era, including Samuel Adams. Let's take a look at this briefly before we move on. With this example, we continue to see a lot of those same traits. There's the tenebrism, it's very linear, you get a sense of the underdrawing of this work, but we've moved away from the craftsman and we have a full-blown image of a revolutionary in this portrait. And in fact, the props that he holds are not his employment, his work, the way they are with Paul Revere, who was a metalsmith. Here we see this great moment in history. Samuel Adams is pointing to a charter, pointing to his demand that the British troops are removed from the town. This is the day after, or the days after, the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, in which Samuel Adams is taking actions forward against the English. And so we're commemorating this event. And so we might start to get the idea, looking at these portraits, that Copley was part of this radical association, the way that we will later see that Jacques-Louis David was very much a part of the radical side of the French Revolution. But this was not so. Let's take a look at the spectrum of portraits that Copley would paint. So wait a minute, we have the revolutionary, epitomized here by Paul Revere, but we also have some people that weren't so revolutionary, the Tories, the elite, the aristocrat, the loyalist to the crown. We have this beautiful portrait here of Mrs. Bowers, and we also have, what's this? It looks like a redcoat, a British soldier, so the same guy who's painting all the great revolutionary heroes is also painting the people they were fighting against? Exactly. That is what he does. So we have portraits of many different officers from the British Army during this period. And it was through those connections, Thomas Gage in particular, that he was able to get that painting, that 1765 painting of the boy with the squirrel, sent over to England, where Sir Joshua Reynolds, Benjamin West, and others saw it, praised it, and had encouraged him to come. But as we see from this time period, from 63, 68 to 70, and then that previous portrait, 1772, with Sam Adams, this is that period where things are revving up in the Revolution, and also that decade which Singleton Copley really gets his skills up to par, and in 1774 he decides it's finally time to make that leap, partly due to what's going on in the colonies, and partly due to him finally wanting to make that next step, wanting to go beyond being just a portrait painter in the colonies to perhaps being a portrait painter amongst the greatest painters in his opinion, and also perhaps try his hand at history painting. And we'll see how all of that comes together in part 2.